Good morning and welcome to today's event in our 15th annual China conference. We're looking forward to hearing from Susan Shirk shortly. Steve, over to you.
All right. Well, good morning. Welcome to the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University, and to a book launch titled Overreach: How China Derailed Its Peaceful Rise, with the author of the book, Professor Susan Shirk from the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego. My name is Steve Suranovic. I'm a professor in the economics department here at GW, and I'm the director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP as we like to call it. I'm delighted to welcome you to our second feature in a series of events we will hold this academic year on China's economic development and the US-China economic relationship. If you're interested in this event, stay tuned for more on this issue coming your way, including a full-day conference planned for April 7th of next year. This year at IIEP, we're celebrating our 15th anniversary, and also the 15th anniversary of our annual China conference. Our plan for that conference is to offer a retrospective of the US-China relationship over the past 15 years and a prospective of what might be coming in the near future. For that reason, today's talk is an excellent preview of that day-long event, as Professor Shirk will discuss how China has changed its political course during the past decade under Xi Jinping. In a moment, I'll turn the platform over, but I do want to take a few minutes to thank IIEP and our executive circle of supporters for helping make today's event possible. To our IIEP staff for their support for this event, including Kyle Renner, our institute manager, who directs all of this background activity, and to Bruce Dickson for agreeing to be a discussant, and Barbara Stallings, who's moderating today's talk. For those of you who don't know us, IIEP is located here at the Elliott School, and we are a cross-school interdisciplinary research center. Our objective is to serve as a catalyst for high-quality research on policy issues surrounding economic globalization, which includes international trade, international finance, development economics, poverty studies, climate change, and economic policy more broadly. During the past 2 years, we've held over 175 events, and we have a number of upcoming events, which I will not mention now, but you can find on our website at iiep.gwu.edu. Also, recordings of all of our older events, including this one eventually, can be found on our YouTube channel at IIEPGW. So, without further ado, let me pass the mic over to my colleague, Barbara Stallings.
Thanks, Steve. And thanks to all of you for being here with us at our virtual event this morning. We are lucky to have the author of a new book on the US and China, which is causing lots of buzz, both in academic and policy circles. The author, as you know, is Susan Shirk, coming to us today from San Diego. And the book is Overreach: How China Derailed Its Peaceful Rise, published earlier this year by Oxford. Professor Shirk will give a presentation on various aspects of the book, which will be followed by comments by Professor Bruce Dickson, a China expert here at GW. I'm going to introduce both of them right away, and then we will go directly into the two presentations. Susan Shirk is one of the country's leading experts on China. She first went to China in the early 1970s, so she has a long historical view of changes in that country. She's currently a research professor at the School for Global Policy and Strategy.
As Barbara was saying, she's currently a research professor and chair of the 21st Century China Center. She is one of the most influential experts working on US-China relations and Chinese politics. She's also director emeritus of the UC Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation. Her current book, as you know, is Overreach: How China Derailed Its Peaceful Rise. But other books include China, a Fragile Superpower.
I'm back.
And with that, I can now pass the baton back over to Barbara. This is the IIEP Relay.
That's right, exactly. Okay, we're just talking about the two books.
Yes, exactly. Go for it.
Very good. I've got this too. The Political Logic of Economic Reform in China, which was the first book that I knew about in terms of Susan's work, and China, Fragile Superpower, both of which were path-breaking studies that helped shape our views of China and the relationship between China and the US. In addition to her academic work, Professor Shirk is known for her policy experience. She was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the East Asia Bureau from 1997 to 2000, and also was founder of the Northeast Asia Cooperation Dialogue, of which she continues to be an active member. She holds a PhD in political science from MIT. Bruce Dickson is also a well-known expert on Chinese politics. In addition, he works on Asian politics more broadly and on issues of political change and democratization. He's a professor of political science and international affairs at GW, the former chair of the political science department, and chair of the Seeger Center on Asian Studies. His most recent book, The Party and the People, Chinese Politics in the 21st Century, was published in 2021 by Princeton. Previously, he published many other books. The ones that particularly interested me were several on the role of the private sector in China. For example, Wealth into Power, the Communist Party's embrace of China's private sector, and also Red Capitalists in China. Professor Dickson holds a PhD in political science from the University of Michigan. So after the two presentations, we'll open up for general discussion. Please put your questions in the Q&A function, not chat, Q&A, and we will get to as many of them as possible. So let me turn the mic over here to Professor Susan Shirk.
Well, thank you very much, Barb. And you didn't mention that we were both political science students at Mount Holyoke College.
That's right. That's right.
And have known each other for longer than 50 years. So anyway, our professors would be proud of us, I'm sure. Well, it's a great opportunity for me to talk with you and the audience at IIEP. And I really very much appreciate the work you're doing. I hope I'll have an opportunity to come to your day-long conference because I'm very interested in how the conflict, the geopolitical conflict between the United States and China is affecting the whole global economy, not just what's going on in the two countries. So I am an old China hand. I've been studying China since the 1960s, and I was lucky enough to visit China in 1971. At the same time, Henry Kissinger was there arranging the Nixon visit. And I did have the opportunity also to serve in government in the second Bill Clinton administration. So, and you know, for most of my career studying China, it's really been China has been a very positive story. Relations between China and the world, including the United States, were improving. And of course, the lives of people in China also were getting better. There was more individual freedom to choose your job, where you lived, as well as your living standards were improving. And this happy story started coming to an end in the mid-2000s, which was kind of a shock to me and puzzling. And so the motivation for writing the book is to figure out what was going on, why this happened, to address this puzzle. I think it's important to point out that the success that China had in rising peacefully. So that's one of the, I titled the book, How China Derailed Its Peaceful Rise. Nowadays, people may have forgotten that China was rising peacefully. And the reason for that is that policymakers in the United States, as well as in the United States and other countries, contributed to that smooth rise. In China, the leaders had what I consider a pretty sophisticated understanding of how their increasing capabilities, their rapid improvement in the size and the level of their economy, as well as their military strengthening, would inevitably lead other countries to view them as a threat. In other words, they kind of understood how power transition, or what's more commonly called the Thucydides threat would create these threat perceptions on the part of the United States. I mean, they even had study projects and trainings of party officials and documentaries in which they examined the examples of other rising powers in order to understand why why many of them had led to war, but some of them didn't. And certainly their intention was to avoid war. So what they did is try to reassure other countries that although their capabilities were improving very rapidly, their intentions were benign, their intentions were friendly. And they did that not just through their policy rhetoric, but through their actions of signing on to many global and regional multilateral organizations, to developing trade agreements with their neighbors, other countries joining the WTO. So, and of course, the United States facilitated this peaceful rise by giving China a seat at the table and treating it with respect. So, you know, this was an unusually successful experiment, I might say, in mitigating the Thucydides trap through statesmanship and pragmatic policy on both sides. But in the mid-2000s, things changed, and that's the puzzle that I wanted to understand. And what we saw was that even before the global financial crisis, which is the cause that most people, when they look at this shift in policy, they attribute it to the financial crisis and this triumphalism in China, observing American mistakes in their own financial management system, and the fact that China recovered faster from the financial crisis than the United States struggled for quite a long time to recover. And they concluded that the US was on the decline and the US was on the rise, and it created a demand inside China for a more muscular foreign policy, more assertiveness. You know, no need to bite our tongue anymore. We can say what we really think. And certainly the global financial crisis did have that effect. But what's interesting is that some of China's overreach, this shift in policy, begins even before the global financial crisis, and then is reinforced by this triumphalism that emerged during the financial crisis. So what we see, and let me just mention three examples that got my attention. The first one, and the most important one for foreign policy, international relations, is China's behavior in the South China Sea. Beginning in 2006, China's civilian maritime vessels start asserting China's very expansive claims to the South China Sea and the land features within it, and shoving around the fishing boats, drilling maritime vessels from the other claimants, the Southeast Asian claimants. And this was puzzling to me because the South China Sea had not been a focal point of Chinese popular nationalism up until that time. There was very little mention of it in the popular media or the state media. And, you know, I was puzzled why this started around 2006. And the second example, and what's important about this behavior in the South China Sea is not just that the South China Sea is of such economic and strategic importance, but also that this really changed the narrative about what kind of rising power China was. Because if the Chinese government was willing to antagonize its neighbors, then in order to assert its claim over these rocks, basically, then it was not the kind of pragmatic, peacefully rising power that we once thought it was. So very important in changing China's image with its neighbors as well as with the United States. But then we can see that there were also two other important shifts that occurred at the same time related to domestic policy. One is that before the Olympics, the 2008 Beijing Olympics, we saw a significant tightening up of social control in China and censorship of the commercial media and internet. And at the time, I thought, well, this is just something that happens typically in China before major events. They tighten up controls to make sure there are no unpleasant surprises. Then after the event, things go back to normal, they loosen up again. But that did not happen in this instance. In fact, the tightening up just continued over time, right to the present day. So what was going on? It wasn't the popular nationalism that I had studied in my book, Fragile Superpower. So I didn't have a good answer. And that's why I started studying Chinese policy-making process more directly and doing a lot of interviewing beginning in the mid-2000s, actually even before then, to try to understand the policy-making process. And so I think one of the most surprising findings of my book is that China's overreach began even before Xi Jinping in the Hu Jintao era of collective leadership. So before I get into the dynamic of the overreach during the collective leadership of Hu Jintao, and then now in Xi Jinping's more concentrated, personalistic leadership system, let me first explain what overreach means. The reason I chose this word to be the title of my book is because I think it's so apropos. Overreach means to take things too far, to do things in an exaggerated manner in a way that then snaps back to harm yourself. It's behavior that backfires against yourself, is costly to yourself. And that's the message that I'm certainly sending to Chinese readers, if they're able to read the book, which is that China was rising peacefully, but then the nature of the policy-making institutions led to these choices that were counterproductive from the standpoint of China's own interests. And we certainly see that today, overreach has backfired against China. We see the costs piling up, the international costs. We see a number of coalitions developing to balance against China. The threat perceptions have grown very inflamed and acute, and China's neighbors are joining these coalitions together with the United States and even European powers to balance against the China threat. And it's economically costly in that many of these countries, including the United States, are erecting walls to prevent China from trading, investing, sending their talented young people to study in the United States. So it is definitely impeding China's economic development as well as its national security by creating these balancing coalitions. And finally, the domestic threats against China's domestic overreach are also piling up. We see that China's growth has slowed for demographic, secular reasons. There are other reasons for the slowing growth, but some of the slowed growth is self-inflicted. It's because of the crackdown on the private sector, which was particularly evident in 2021. The unemployment has become a problem for the first time in a long time because the private sector, which is what generates most of the jobs in China, has been whacked by Chinese regulations and by a crackdown on some whole industries like the after-school tutoring industry. Also, of course, the persistent implementation of this extreme zero COVID policy also took a big hit on the economy, and many people in China were not able to get to their jobs. They lost their income. So it was really a very devastating example of overreach. So overreach, I think, is apropos because these policies have been clearly costly to China. So let me now say something about, and then just to give an overview of the book. So I describe the mechanism by which collective leadership, surprisingly, counterintuitively, led to overreach. Then I talk about how we got to Xi Jinping, because the collective leadership, in addition to producing overreach, also produced massive corruption and public splits in the leadership, which became the campaign platform for Xi Jinping to establish a very different type of leadership system in which there was a powerful core leader, strongman leader, and to consolidate more power than any other Chinese leader since Mao Zedong. And then I talk about how what is the mechanism by which concentrated personalistic leadership causes overreach. And then finally, in the last chapter, because this is not really a policy book per se, this is a book on Chinese domestic politics and foreign policy, similar to Fragile Superpower, but in this case, I focus more based largely on interviews with a lot of different types of people, officials, party insiders, military people, private business people, journalists, academic advisors of government, to try to understand how the policymaking process works and why it inclined China toward overreach under collective leadership, as well as under this more personalistic leadership system. But then in the last chapter, I do get to policy, offering advice both to Chinese leaders and to American leaders about how to stabilize relations between these two important global powers. So let me now take a moment to talk about collective leadership and how the dynamic which in collective leadership that led to overreach, and why this is so puzzling, because the Xi Jinping, the Hu Jintao leadership was really the kind of leadership that Deng Xiaoping sought to establish after Mao Zedong died. Because Deng, and actually the book starts with the Deng era, Deng was focused on preventing the return to another strongman dictatorial system like Mao's. He critiqued the Mao system, not by criticizing Mao personally, but saying that that system was a system of over-concentration of power that led to arbitrary decisions like the tragic campaigns of the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution. So this insight of Deng Xiaoping and his willingness to say these things so soon, just in 1980, so, just 4 years after Mao Zedong died, was really remarkable. And it's the reason why I would say, to a certain extent, Deng is the hero of the book, but he's very much a flawed hero who failed to prevent the return to an overconcentration of leadership under Xi Jinping. And I think that's because he really didn't take de-Maoization, if you will, far enough. And he certainly was not willing to see a politically independent legislature or judicial system, which might have provided a check on Xi Jinping's power play when he made it in 2018 and revised the Constitution to eliminate the term limits for top leadership and to trash this system of peaceful turnover of power at the top, which was the most remarkable accomplishment of the post-Mao communism in China. China was really the first country to have achieved this peaceful turnover of power at the top, so that it was regular, predictable. Every 10 years, you would have a new leader. And of course, it reduced the risk of power struggles at the top, instability that might actually bring down the whole regime. But what Deng's approach to this problem was to introduce term limits, retirement age, and peaceful turnover of power at the top, and a collective leadership, the Standing Committee of the Politburo, that very much resembled the ones that he and his colleagues had tried to introduce modeled on the Soviet system back in 1956. But Mao had resisted that, and after a few years returned to a more concentrated, personalistic dictatorship. So the collective leadership also included a central committee, which really, according to the rules of the Chinese Communist Party, and this is written down, one of the rules that's written down, the central committee has the authority to choose the top leaders, and which meant that when the nominations for the general secretary and the standing committee were being made, they had to anticipate the preferences of the central committee, which is a body of about 200 regular members, about the same number of alternate members. Only the regular members get to vote on personnel issues. And what's interesting is that within the Central Committee, who are the members? The members are all officials of the central government, the Central Party organizations, the People's Liberation Army, and actually the largest block in the Central Committee is provincial party secretaries and governors. So the provinces are not just the agents of the central government in this hierarchical system, because of course they are appointed to their jobs by the party leaders and the organization department. So it's they're not elected. There are no bottom-up elections of officials, really. So it's a hierarchical system, but there's what I called in my political logic book, this reciprocal accountability between the officials who sit in the Central Committee and the top leaders. Of course, the hierarchical authority is much stronger because these people in the Central Committee hold their jobs by virtue of being appointed by the top leadership, but they do have the authority to reject the nominations of the top leaders for the next set of top leaders. So I thought this was really important. I guess Deng Xiaoping did too, because he created this system and was counting on the Central Committee to check the concentration of power at the top and to preserve collective leadership. But guess what? In 2018, when Xi Jinping comes in and changes the constitution, scraps term limits, you don't hear a peep from these people. And at the 20th Party Congress, there's just no sign of any resistance to Xi Jinping's power play of not just getting a third term, but also ignoring retirement age parameters and getting rid of a few leaders from the standing committee, people who were not from his faction, from another faction, and might have and had their own followings. They had a certain amount of authority and might have been expected to question Xi Jinping's judgments. But instead, he fired them, ignoring the age parameters, including Hu Chunhua, a much younger official who at one time was considered the likely successor for the next generation of leadership. No successor in training, everyone a loyalist crony of Xi Jinping's. So, and the Central Committee didn't resist. No sign of opposition. So what this says to me, if you ask, how did we end up with Xi Jinping? We ended up with Xi Jinping because collective leadership had shortcomings, especially massive corruption and public splits in the leadership, and also because the Central Committee was inadequate to check the concentration of power at the top. Let me just quickly, how much time do you think I have here? Another 15 minutes maybe, or not? Barb?
Yes, that should be fine. Yes.
Okay.
Go
So
ahead.
I'm not going to detail the list of all of the examples of overreach from China, because it ends up sounding like a prosecutor. And I think many of these actions, especially the foreign policy ones, as well as the domestic policy ones, are familiar to most people. I mean, of course, foreign policy includes ramping up military and paramilitary pressure against Japan in the East China Sea, against Taiwan, economic coercion against Australia for calling for a international scientific investigation of COVID origins, other economic coercion against South Korea, against Lithuania, against Norway for the Nobel Prize, Liu Xiaobo. I mean, and continuing this very provocative building of islands in the South China Sea. So I think all of this is probably familiar to most people about China's international overreach. Domestically, of course, the way when social control has grown all the more repressive, with the extreme end of that repression being the thought reform camps in Xinjiang. Also, the takeover of Hong Kong, violating Chinese commitments to allow Hong Kong to retain its autonomy for 50 years, the new national security law, so that we have a party security organization now with an open office in Hong Kong, restricting elections in Hong Kong so that only the patriots who declare their allegiance to Beijing get to run, destroying the democratic movement in Hong Kong. There are, and then in economic policy, what we see is that all of these decades of decentralization to the firm level and to local governments have been reversed. Everything is top down, and no more experimentation. And the state sector and the state bureaucracies are stronger than ever, and the private sector gets squeezed out, despite the importance of the private sector for innovation in China and for employment. And the focus now is very much on self-reliance and state-led industrial policy. So I'm not going to detail all of the examples of overreach, but let me just say a little bit about what is the decision-making dynamic of collective leadership that leads to overreach. This was a surprise to me because, and I think many China scholars have looked at China's collective leadership as a consensus building arrangement, so that the people who sit around the table in the standing committee or in the Politburo, that they have mutual vetoes and that they therefore are able to check one another. And so they should exercise restraint. They should end up with maybe stasis, inertia, but not overreach. Taking things too far was really surprising. So then I read Jack Snyder's classic book, Myths of Empire, and he talks about pre-war Germany and Japan and how the concentrated bureaucratic interest groups, economic interest groups, engaged in a log roll with one another that led to overexpansion. So this was very similar to the dynamic that I saw under collective leadership, in which, and in particular, I focus in Hu Jintao's collective leadership on what I call the control coalition, the internal security apparatus, together with the propaganda department and the military and the People's Armed Police. The control coalition was very powerful and managed to hijack policy under collective leadership. But we also see other bureaucratic interest groups. For example, in the case of the South China Sea, there are actually 8 or 9 different bureaucracies that benefited from hyping the international threat of these other claimants and taking away China's sovereignty over the sea and the islands. And they started enforcing China's sovereignty claims, Weitran, in a more muscular way, using their civilian vessels. The military actually wasn't that happy about it when it started, but the military in the end ends up backing them up. But it was not a concerted policy from Hu Jintao. It was these multiple bureaucracies that led to overreach in the South China Sea. So, and this log roll, of course, when we talk about log rolling, we're usually talking about the US Congress. We're talking about a legislative setting. So it's not an identical, it's not quite the right metaphor. But what it means is that these concentrated bureaucratic interest groups were able to build up their budgets, their bureaucratic influence by hyping international as well as domestic threats and supporting one another's efforts. They allowed each of the political oligarchs in the standing committee, and under who there were 9, allowed them to govern their own domain with nobody questioning how they operated. Nobody questioning it. And Hu Jintao also did not have the temperament or the heft to check them either. So the leader didn't exercise restraint. And one reason for that is that Jiang Zemin, the former leader, the retired leader, was still interfering, especially in personnel appointments. So Hu, in some ways, actually never established clear control over the military. And there are numerous instances of almost outright insubordination on the part of the military that Hu Jintao was not able to control, or at least lack of coordination. And all of those stories are detailed in my book. So, you know, Jack Snyder, who's been very helpful to me, raised a really important question to me as I was writing the book, which is, why did the control coalition dominate the policy process? Why couldn't there have been a reform coalition? What's the counterfactual? Because in the first term of Hu Jintao, this was really a high point of political reform and openness. It's very notable, especially in the media, you know, tremendous debates on Weibo, social media, a real public sphere emerging, and the commercial media engaging in investigative reporting of the abuses of local government mostly, but still it was a very freewheeling and open period. There was a lot of talk about intra-party democracy as a step toward broader democracy. And, you know, one thing I hope that readers of the book will learn from is to see that China was not always the police state it is today, that we had this opportunity that was lost. And it was lost, I think, because Hu Jintao was never able to build a reform coalition to balance against the control coalition, which included a more statist economic policy too. So I think he could have. And the reason I say I think he could have is that leaders like Wen Jiabao, the premier, like Wang Yang, who at the time was party secretary in Guangdong province, they were talking like proto-democracy people. They were criticizing the decision-making system, favoring openness, and they were appealing to some constituency in Koheit constituency out there. They're smart politicians. Li Yuanchao did this too, the head of the organization department. So there was the possibility of taking, say, and I'm interested to hear what Bruce Dickson has to say about this, the private sector, especially the coastal provinces, white collar professionals, intellectuals. You know, I think there was the possibility of a reform coalition that could have balanced against the control coalition, but it was Hu Jintao never went so far as to really develop it. So that's the counterfactual. And instead, China turned more toward international overreach, social control, media control, and the state dominance of the economy and the suppression of the private sector. And we see, especially under Xi Jinping now, suppressing the private sector because he appears to view it as a political threat to him, that these entrepreneurs have the ability, the wealth, the power to organize, to constrain him, or even potentially in the future to bring him down. So he has, he's devastated the private sector out of his own insecurity and worries about his survival and the survival of his leadership system in the party. So let me now just say a little bit about the personalistic leadership system. Now, of course, it would have been so much neater if I could have shown that the concentration of power led to a return to a peaceful rise. Now, of course, that would have been unusual because those who study the foreign policy of authoritarian regimes typically find that personalistic dictatorships are more risk takers and they engage in more conflict behavior than more institutionalized systems. But it's actually, Snyder suggests that, stronger core leadership can manage the risks of overexpansion if they want to. But in the case of Xi Jinping, he didn't seem to want to. In fact, he was an even more ambitious leader, much more ambitious leader than his predecessors, Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin. And he didn't seem to be able to envision a way of realizing those ambitions through more accommodating, responsible behavior. He still talks a good game about win-win global multilateral institutions, but Chinese foreign policy is overreaching. It's not engaging pragmatically and diplomatically with other countries, with the exception, you might argue, of countries in Africa or Latin America. So let me just quickly summarize the dynamic under personalistic leadership that I identify as the driver of overreach. I mean, of course, it starts with Xi Jinping's preferences, but it's not just about Xi Jinping. It's about the whole system. When he came to power, one of the first things he did is introduce this massive anti-corruption campaign, which was hugely popular with the public. But of course, it wasn't just against corruption. It was quite openly and overtly a purge of rivals to Xi Jinping. Rivals imagined as well as actual rivals. According to this anti-corruption campaign purge, criticized some of the top leaders who have been imprisoned, many of them for the rest of their lives. They openly accuse them of plotting conspiracies against the party leadership. So it's not just their graft, it's also their coup attempts. And this purge, which the Discipline Commission's data says now that almost 5 million Chinese officials have been investigated and disciplined, and hundreds of thousands have been punished by being imprisoned. Now it really has taken on the character, because it continues right up to the present day, of what Brzezinski called the permanent purge. We're now in the third wave of the purge. And what's so remarkable about it is among the most prominent targets now are the senior officials who were once so trusted by Xi Jinping that they were the investigators and inquisitors in the first wave. So they're from the security apparatus, the discipline apparatus, and these were people so trusted, but now they have been accused of plotting against the leadership. So what does that mean for the leaders who are now been promoted by Xi Jinping in the 20th Party Congress? Well, yes, they are so trusted as the loyal followers and comrades of Xi Jinping, but they don't know when he might turn against them and accuse them of disloyalty. So this has put tremendous pressure on the entire political system, so that all the officials in the system feel that they have to try their hardest to demonstrate their loyalty to Xi Jinping in order to survive politically, in order to preserve their own careers, their families' opportunities. And as a result, you get this bandwagoning dynamic that was many years ago identified by Avery Goldstein under Mao, so that officials jump on the bandwagon behind Xi Jinping once they figure out what direction he's headed in policy-wise. Then they try to carry out his policies to an extreme degree to make sure they won't be criticized for disloyalty. So they, what you get is implementation over compliance to a more extreme degree than Xi Jinping himself may have originally wanted. And then the information feedback loops don't operate because nobody dares tell Xi Jinping the costs of his policies. So, and we saw this very clearly with zero COVID, certainly wolf warrior diplomacy, this very aggressive rhetoric by Chinese diplomats, starting right with the foreign minister himself. And I've seen myself how this pressure has changed some of the Chinese officials whom I know, who once upon a time were the most pragmatic and imaginative diplomats, who now are just attack dogs for Xi Jinping.
Susan, maybe you can sort of wind up so we can still have some time for questions at the end.
Yeah, so that's basically the mechanism of how Overreach works under collective leadership, how it works under concentrated personalistic leadership. And I think I'll just leave it there. There are a lot of interesting questions about the future, as well as about what is the right way for the US and other countries to address a China that is overreaching the way it is. So I think I'll just leave it there. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to lay out my arguments in greater detail than I have in other presentations.
Terrific. It was really interesting for us, and I'm sure for the audience as well. So let's see what Bruce has to say about some of the ideas, and then we've already got some questions in the Q&A that I want to take time to someone who disagrees with you quite strongly. So I think it will be interesting to hear those comments too. So Bruce, please.
Okay, thanks. Susan, thanks for that great presentation, and also the book that the presentation is based on. It's really interesting to see a book that goes back and forth between domestic policy and foreign policy. Most books on contemporary China really focus on one or the other. So it's nice to get your perspective on how the two really nicely interact. in the interest of time, I want to talk about three themes that run through the book, and then pose a question at the end of each that you either treat as a rhetorical question and not address, or lead into discussion about it. First one is the theme that you talked about at the beginning, that this overreach did not begin with Xi Jinping. It goes back to the Hu Jintao era. Many people have identified 2008, the global financial crisis, and the Olympics also as a source of that triumphalism that you spoke about. But you push it back even to 2006 with the change of China's maritime strategy as a key turning point. It accelerated and continued under Xi, but it really began long before he came into office. So with that in mind, a different counterfactual than the one you talked about, if Xi had not been reappointed for a third term, if a different leader was in position now, would the advice that you give both to Chinese leaders and American leaders be different? In other words, to what extent is China's current foreign policy strategy attributable to Xi himself now? To what degree is it sort of an elite consensus? And to what extent is it really part of a grand strategy of China more systemically that would not change regardless of who the top leader is? The second key theme that much of your talk was based on was the distinction between collective leadership and personalist rule. It's interesting. One of the nice turns of phrase you have in the book is that for Hu Jintao's second term as general secretary, it wasn't a collective leadership so much as it was a collection of leaders, each with their own agendas, each hyping up domestic and international threats to enhance their budgets and other resources. Who wasn't strong enough to say no to anybody. And so that's when this overreach really starts. The shift then, recognizing that collective leadership led to weak leadership, Xi Jinping comes along, to the surprise of most observers, was able to consolidate his power much faster and without resistance, as you were talking about. So neither collective leadership nor personalist rule seems preferable or ideal. Both have led to overreach. So is there a feasible alternative to this as we look forward? Especially in the context where there's weak institutions, how can you get a stable collective leadership that doesn't lead to the divisiveness that the second Hu's second term indicated? And the third key theme is how opaque and how closed this political system is, especially to outside observers. And this also didn't begin with Xi Jinping, or the turn towards both social control and also making it more difficult for us to visit and do the kind of research that had been possible earlier. In more recent years, even before COVID started, it was difficult to get access to officials for interviews. Archives were censored, many of them were closed or limited access to them. Public opinion surveys became increasingly impossible. Your book is full of great quotes and insights from scholars, from officials, journalists, business people, and we don't really have access to them the same way that we did before. So for those of us who are stuck looking in from a distance, what advice do you have for how we should go about studying a country that is increasingly closed off, especially for young scholars who don't have the opportunities for field research that were available before? How do we go about studying this very important country at this key time when the opportunities for as scholars to engage with the type of research that we would do in the past just seems increasingly unlikely? So those are my three themes and questions, and send it back to you.
Very interesting and pointed, Bruce. Susan, can you take just maybe 5 minutes max to
Sure.
go back and forth with Bruce, and then I want to open up for a general discussion.
Yeah, so Bruce, thanks so much for those really stimulating questions. Of course, is it Xi himself who's driving overreach? Is it an elite consensus about this is what China should be doing? Or is it some consistent grand strategy over time? The consistent grand strategy, of course, is the argument that Rush Doshi makes in The Long Game. And I blurbed his book. I endorsed his book because I thought it was really a good book and very well researched. I said he almost persuaded me, but not quite. Because I really do see that none of this is inevitable. I think it's a lot more contingent. I think there's a lot more human agency. I think, and I argued this in Graham Allison's class, where he invited me in to talk about my book in the class he teaches at the Kennedy School. And the students were kind of, I think, a little amazed that Graham and I had kind of a debate about the inevitability of the Thucydides trap versus my approach, which is really, I see policy as the result of the competition among politicians inside China. So I think it's that competitive dynamic among political players that leads to the policy. And you can't really, you can say something about regularities of the institutions, but you can't necessarily predict exactly what will happen. So that actually brings us now to the question of feasible alternatives. I think that, I still think there is that reform coalition out there. And I think that there is a feasible alternative. And I think based on my interviews before COVID started, up to the end of 2019, I've never heard such sharp criticism of a leader and of a leadership system as I heard in China, including from party insiders. And so I think this power sharing system, I mean, the lack of any power sharing at the top now is really means the system is not stable. And I think that there is still a possibility of a pushback against Xi Jinping and some split in the leadership. Now, recognize, of course, it's very hard. Most of the people who might have been involved in such an effort are in jail, but all of their families hate Xi Jinping. And there are a lot of people out there who really think that Xi Jinping's system, he personally in the system is the problem. And they would like to return to a party leadership that is more pragmatic, focuses more on economic development than social control, and is more responsive to the demands of the public. So I think it's still possible. The how to study China today, it reminds me so much of when I started studying China and I interviewed refugees in Hong Kong to know what life was like at the grassroots. So I think we may end up focusing more on the diaspora, learning from them, but also, ever the optimist. Once COVID, now that we've made this reversal, this dramatic reversal on COVID management, I think it's possible that we'll be back doing research in China again, maybe, and I don't think it'll be so impossible to carry out interviews in the future.
Okay, let us see if we can have some discussion in the 15-20 minutes that remain. Let me first see if I can call on our colleague Chao Wei. Can you come on, Chao? And yes, and pose your question. Thank you.
Hi. So it's really a very informative and illuminating presentation. So I have a question about the 2006, the South China Sea dispute you mentioned. So as far as I can see, I'm saying 3 hypotheses there. One hypothesis is, is it because of the economic importance was recognized in 2006? Suppose there was an urgent need for oil, natural gas, and fishing resources that led to the assertiveness of China. That's the first hypothesis. The second hypothesis would be, was that because they recognize the strategic importance of the supply route around that area, and that prompted the action. And the third, if I heard you right, you seem to mention the third possibility that, the flare-up of tension was caused by different fractions among the top leaders fighting for influences, and that pushed for overreach. So what I would like to hear from you is, how do you think about the importance of this 3 possible hypotheses? One is economic importance, second, strategic importance, third is, the bureaucratic fighting for influence, which led to the overreach. So how do we actually distinguish them? Thank you.
Thanks very much for that important question. I am arguing that it is the competition among bureaucratic interest groups. And these bureaucratic interest groups are not necessarily the most powerful ones at all, fisheries. And of course, in the background, it's the fact that there was overfishing, so the fishing boats are going out further. It's also the case that there are new technologies for deep sea drilling and things like that. But I don't think we see any concerted plan on the part of the central leadership to exploit these economic resources. I think it's really a much more uncoordinated effort in the beginning. Now, that's not true today. Nowadays, it's much more a concerted central policy.
Okay, Stephen Kaplan, before I get to your question, I wonder if you could help me. I no longer have access in the Q&A to AJ Chibber's 3-part question. Do you have it? And if so, could you read it?
I do have access, and I'm happy to read it.
It follows up in a way on Chao's question.
Yeah, no, it's terrific. I would like to hear the answer to this as well. So that's perfect. Okay, so it's a 3-part question here, so I'm going to read through it. This is from AJ Chibber. I visited China many times as a senior UN official between 2008 and 2013. When Wen Jiabao was the prime minister, and attended many conferences there until about 2012, and did not see any hint of change in China's stance that they were a developing country, that their focus was peaceful economic development, and that they did not wish to interfere in problems of other countries. So this thesis by Professor Shirk is quite surprising. The BRI is another indicator of a shift, and came under Xi, and Jinping did not, and was not under the prior collective leadership when China felt it must focus largely on its own economic development and bide its time. Belligerence with neighbors has also increased hugely under Xi Jinping and was kept in check prior to that. Don't you think all these points to a big change under President Xi and overreach from that point on?
Great. I appreciate that question. And of course, overreach is even more extreme, much more extreme under Xi Jinping. I don't mean to let Xi Jinping off the hook by any means. But what's interesting is that the direction began earlier. And the challenges in the South China Sea especially began earlier, way when the social control movement of strengthening the internal security forces and these more a combination of old-fashioned Mao methods of people watching one another and reporting on one another combined with technology, that also starts earlier. So it's a matter of degree, but maybe when the degree is so great, then it becomes more than degree. It's character. And I actually thought I'm mostly kind of a revisionist on Hu Jintao with a more positive view of him, especially his first term. And I can't really find anything very good to say about Xi Jinping, except that he finally got the message and changed his COVID management policy this week. But by the way, it's really interesting to read what Xi Jinping said about collective leadership in his political report to the 20th Party Congress. He talked about what China 10 years ago, when before he came to power, it had a weak, hollow, watered down party leadership with privilege seeking, corruption, money worship, hedonism, online discussion was rife with disorder, so he's still making the case why concentrated leadership is far better than that collective leadership, which actually says to me that there are plenty of people in China who actually now yearn to go back to the good old days of collective leadership.
Actually, my question follows on this point right here, and is also a callback to Professor Dickson's question as well, in terms of how, if China's been in this overreach equilibrium for quite some time, if anything, we've seen it then intensify under President Xi. Where's the exit strategy, right? How does China exit this equilibrium, if at all? And so in part, when you're answering Bruce's questions, right, you referenced the Reform Coalition, right? Sort of a potential latent reform coalition that is still out there. And I was wondering, I'd just like to hear more details about, I guess, what an entrepreneur might look like, right? Or how do you catalyze such a latent reform coalition under these conditions, right? So what might change look like, and how do we know it when we see it?
Before you get to that, Susan, there's a question in the Q&A, which is very much along this line. So let me just add that into Stephen's question. It says, is there still a reform faction after a decade of anti-corruption campaigns? And if so, why don't they try to play more of a policy role? Is this weakness or fear or both?
Well, I don't want to come across as naive about this. Repression, the kind of restrictions that politicians have in communicating with one another at the very top is a real impediment. I really don't think the complete lack of power sharing is a stable situation. So I don't know if I'd say it's an equilibrium. It's meaning that other politicians are certainly not happy about being intimidated by Xi Jinping. And they don't like the quality of his decisions either, and how counterproductive they are for China's economic prosperity and dynamism. So I think there's some possibility of resistance or pushback at the elite level. And I think the risks of a split in the leadership are much higher than some bottom-up revolution, middle-class revolution or something like that. Although I can't believe that the middle class is really happy about the way their children are being educated, the greater difficulty in studying English, the increase in political classes, and all of this ideology, Marxist ideology and propaganda. I mean, it's, Kevin Rudd talks about how Xi Jinping is such a Marxist. I mean, is this really appealing to China's growing middle class? It's hard for me to understand that, if that's true. I don't think it is true. These were people who love to travel abroad. They're quite cosmopolitan. So what happens is really, really hard to say. And the exit strategy, I mean, I was imagining before the 20th Party Congress that people like Li Keqiang and Wang Yang, Hu Chunhua, they might approach Xi Jinping privately and say, oh, China has so many huge problems and it's so unfair that everyone is blaming you. And it's just, it's really not fair. And we would be glad to share more of this responsibility with you. Why don't we divvy up the leadership of the commissions and the leading groups? Why don't we let everyone know that we're going to be meeting as a group more regularly? Why don't we, emphasize, because of course it always has been collective leadership, but I think to restore confidence and to reduce your burden, we're happy to share with you, like a soft intervention. Obviously did not happen. That was a dream. And, could it happen today? Those leaders now have been kicked out. Are they under such supervision that they couldn't organize some kind of intervention? I don't know. It's impossible to say.
Maggie Chen, are you still there or have you already left?
Yes, I have a question about the interaction between the overreaching that Professor Shirk emphasized and the perceived external environment. Do you see any of the overreaching documented in your book could be a response to the perceived external environment, policy environment, especially the hostility perceived by the government?
Well, of course, that's the Xi Jinping line. And it's actually a line about hostile foreign forces that starts a long time ago. You hear it in the discussion, internal discussion about Tiananmen too, blaming the Tiananmen protests on hostile foreign forces. Color revolutions, obviously, what became an important trope in this conspiratorial kind of paranoid view. But if you look at American foreign policy during this period, look at the Obama administration's effort. This Obama administration was the first presidential administration in a long time that didn't campaign on being tougher toward China. It came into office intending to sustain engagement with China from the previous administration. They traveled to China, engaged in reassurance behavior with China, but the Obama visit turned out very badly because the Chinese were just afraid of him. And they were afraid that he was so charismatic that he might arouse a social upheaval. They looked at his speech in Egypt, and they worried about what was happening in North Africa. And, they were just had this kind of, there was this kind of fear that they had a very cold visit with his first visit. There were a lot of Chinese pushback against the United States that as far as I can tell, there was nothing the United States was doing that might have caused that. And now Chinese will tell you today that it was the pivot to Asia. It was the buildup under Obama, the idea of the pivot of China feeling encircled, and therefore Chinese policy was reactive. But even the pivot was very carefully done to not overtly be framed as a balancing coalition against China. So, I'm sure the people who are trying to defend a more assertive, aggressive Chinese policy definitely blamed it on US action. But I think if you look at the sequence of the interaction of policy, it's a pretty hard case to make.
Okay, well, I think that we have unfortunately run out of time. I'm sad that I didn't get my questions in, but I am delighted that we had such an interesting talk and such a lively discussion. So thank you, Susan. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you to everybody who participated. And stay tuned for other events at IIEP. Have a good weekend. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.